Hola, compadres. Today's topic is on civil rights throughout history. The definition of civil rights is most commonly known as gaining the same individual rights applied towards everyone else. The fight for civil rights has slowly been fought for by people of all ages, color, and genders. The first group we'll be talking about is the civil rights for African Americans. Discrimination towards African Americans dates back to the 1400s when Europeans colonized them and believed it was their right to civilize them. They were thus set into slavery until being freed after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. But the racism was still there. Progress towards civil rights for African Americans was slow, with only a few changes being made. The 13th Amendment, which was established in 1864, ended slavery, and the Jim Crow laws, which created separate but equal facilities, which of course things weren't equal. Further legislation regarding African American civil rights. Things eventually grow better. As the 14th Amendment was created, becoming the support against Jim Crow laws, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case, which supported the Jim Crow laws, and the executive order, which was beneficial since it desegregated the armed forces.
Various civil rights acts have been passed over the years. In 1866, it declared that anyone born in the U.S. without ties to foreign nations had the rights to become a citizen. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act declared that it prohibited intimidation, coercion, or interference in federal elections, and was the first civil rights legislation to be passed from Congress since the Reconstruction era. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act removed discrimination from the workplace against all minorities, whether it be by race, gender, or religion, and illegalized segregation from all facilities that were open to the public. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests. Early abolitionists include Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who, after escaping, taught himself and became an example of intelligence to blacks and was an orator and a writer. John Brown was a radical abolitionist, and he and his sons killed 5 people who supported slavery to try and liberate the slaves. Sojourner Truth was another former slave who gave the speech Ain't I a Woman, which held both the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movements. In the speech, he called for gender and racial equality. Webb Du Bois helped form the NAACP and was the first black to earn a PhD from Harvard and encouraged blacks to resist segregation. Booker T. Washington was a former slave and wanted blacks to accept segregation, unlike Webb Du Bois, and focused on vocational skills to improve their place in the world. Leaders in African civil rights movement in the more modern days include Martin Luther King Jr., who followed the ideals of Thoreau and Gandhi by organizing nonviolent protests. He was a powerful orator, helped found the SCLC, organized the Birmingham Campaign, wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail, helped organize the March on Washington, D.C., and there gave the I Have a Dream speech. Malcolm X was a radical civil rights leader. He called for self-defense retaliation for blacks, and later had a change of heart and called for total racial peace. Stokely Carmichael was a former member of the SCLC, but was tired of their slow progress and formed the Black Power movement, in which he promoted black pride and separation. African American civil rights organizations include the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and tried to put an end to the Jim Crow laws. The SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which consisted of Southern ministers including Martin Luther King, and encouraged nonviolence and organized the Montgomery bus boycott and the Birmingham campaign. CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality, who helped organize the Freedom Rides, and the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which provided opportunities for the youth to get involved in the civil rights cause. Early events in the African American civil rights movement included Freedom Rides, which was an interracial group that rode buses to test the new changes in bus segregation laws. They were met by much anger from the whites and were attacked by mobs and arrested until protection was given to them by the government. In the Little Rock Crisis and the Little Rock Nine, there were 9 children who were chosen to be the first colored kids to attend Little Rock High School in Arkansas. They were blocked entry by the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, and the National Guard. Eisenhower later sent in the U.S. Army to protect and escort the children.
Another one of the events was the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer. This encouraged blacks to become voters because they're still being intimidated by others because they're Africans. Another was the Mississippi Burning, which was 3 civil rights workers who went missing while volunteering at the Freedom Summer. And they were eventually found, but they were shot and buried by members of the KKK and a sheriff. Next group is the struggle for women's rights. Women's rights existed since the time of the Revolutionary War, involving Republic motherhood. This was when women were responsible for raising the children of the next generation, because they would eventually be running this country. This ended with the 19th Amendment that gave all women the right to vote. Some leaders in this event was Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, President John Adams, and she urged him not to forget women when he was helping create this new country. Another was Susan B. Anthony. She was a women's suffrage leader for the women's suffrage She was a leader for the women's suffrage movement and co-founded the National Women's Suffrage Association along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Amelia Earhart was the first solo pilot female to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. Alice Paul also contributed because she was a radical suffrage and created the National Women's Party after being tired of the slow progression of other women's rights organizations. Lucy Burns organized a parade in Washington, D.C., who was led by Inez Milholland on March 3rd, 1913. Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. This later became known as the Planned Parenthood in 1940. She was not liked very much because this was a crazy idea back then. And then we have legislation for women's rights. The 19th Amendment extended the right to vote in federal and state elections to women. And Title IX came along, which was a U.S. ruling that banned gender discrimination in any federal assisted educational program or activity. Roe v. Wade legislated abortion on the ideal of women's rights to privacy. The Equal Pay Act in 1963 allowed men and women to be paid the same amount of work in the same organization. And the glass ceiling was the idea that there is a barrier that prevents women from advancing in organizations and politics.
Alright, so some civil rights for women. Basically, the civil rights problem was, it was born way back when pre-American society, like when we still had colonies. But skipping ahead in history, one of the most important events in the civil rights movement was the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, when women of all ages and a little bit of men discussed the current conditions of women in the civil rights category. At the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments was written, which tried to give women the right to vote, amongst other rights. And then in the 1920s, during the Jazz Age, there was a group of women called the Flappers who rebelled against traditional thinking on how women should act. They basically changed the appearance of women during that time. The Oberlin College in 1837 was the first college in the country to allow female students, which was a big step in the movement. Some symbolism in the movement. Rosie the Riveter was a symbol of World War II that promoted the ability of women to be helpful in the country and still be feminine, which was a big change because women were used to being, at home taking care of the kids without much purpose in society, and Rosie the Riveter was a big symbol during that time. The double standard, which was the idea that it is okay for men to do something while it is unacceptable for women. To get down to some specifics, a lot of the minorities, such as the Native Americans, assimilation was the process of which a minority group could gradually adopt the customs and attitudes of the majority group, which we've seen
throughout history, such as the Irish and the Germans when they migrated here way back when. Reservations were created for Native Americans, which were areas given by the federal government set aside for the Native Americans. Um, Going back, there was a Wounded Knee in 1890, which over 200 Native American women and children and men were gunned down by the U.S. Army. The biggest thing in the Native American civil rights movement was the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in 1968, Native American rights movement that led to the return of lost civil rights to Native Americans. Asian civil rights, the Yellow Power. In 1860s, the Asians were used to build the Transcontinental Railroad and were harshly discriminated with no actual civil rights. When it hit the 60s and 70s, the Asian civil rights movement began, much largely because it was after the African American civil rights movement, which also gave birth to Yellow Power, which was a form of Black Power. Many of these members were Japanese internees or children of these internees from World War II. The Asian American Political Alliance was an organization formed by college students to work together to form rights and cultural knowledge for all Asian Americans. Some civil rights for the youngsters. I'm going to butcher these names, but Tinker versus Des Moines stated that the constitutional rights for children did not end when they got to school, so basically there was civil rights at school. Hazelwood versus Colmier stated that the censorship of school newspapers did not violate the First Amendment. New Jersey versus TLO established reasonable suspicion as a standard to search students. So that's our video. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys in class.
Bye.